Good morning. It is September 20th, and we are still in the throes of a pretty harsh drought that has continued to increase and develop. Weather forecast next week does look somewhat promising, I know, for northern Ohio, with chances of rain for about 5 out of the 6 days that are upcoming. Now, not high chances, but better than zero. That way it will go. Conditions have continued to turn drier and drier, so we see turf browning out, and we're also seeing some of this impact some of the landscape beds as well, as material is starting to suffer where no irrigation is being applied. Online today, we got Dr. Dave Gardner, Dr. Dave Shtlar, and Dr. Drs Wu. Dr. Gardner, take it away.
Well, good morning, everybody. And yes, I was talking to the climatologist earlier this week. Ed, I need permission to share my screen. And he had mentioned that this is probably the worst drought that we've had since at least 1988, and perhaps going as far back as the 1970s. I had mentioned to him that if you go to that drought monitoring webpage, that at the bottom, if you click on a specific county, if you go to the bottom of the page for each county, there's a graph over time dating to the year 2000 when they started the new D0 through D4 index, D4 being exceptional drought. And this is the first time that we've been in a D3 or a D4 drought, anywhere in Ohio, since they began monitoring drought in that way. And so if you were thinking to yourself that this is something that you don't normally see, you're right. This is something that we don't normally see. But let's talk a little bit about, some things to consider. Now, I go on tirades every now and again about the merits of watering your lawn or a turf space with an oscillating sprinkler that's designed to deliver an inch of water in an hour. And what I'm showing you here is my yard in the foreground and my neighbor's yard in the distance. And I have watered a total of 4 times this year. Tried to time those out 30 minutes each time, no more than that, because there's no point in putting out any more than that. By that time, I've put down somewhere between 4/10 and 5/10, which is honestly probably a little bit too much, but that's enough to wet the thatch and then, hopefully get the top, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch uniformly moistened. Um, if you run the sprinkler for longer than that, it's either going to sit there or it's going to run off, because remember, the infiltration capacities of most of our constructed soils is no more than 1/10 of an inch per hour, which is why everybody says there's nothing like a rain, right? If it's raining hard enough that you don't want to stand outside in it, it's probably 1/10 of an inch an hour or more. Most of the time when it rains, it's 1/10 of an inch or an hour or less, and the soil can take that up, at that rate of rainfall. But when you are artificially irrigating, the delivery is too quickly. And so, while I would say that mine is not in excellent condition, I would say that it's doing okay for having only irrigated it for a total of 2 hours over the course of the drought. Now, if you compare across the street to my neighbor's lawns there, so the one to the right, they've also watered about an hour or 2 hours a week since July. And then my neighbor to the left has basically left theirs gone dormant. A couple of things about this. Mine is a little bit more resilient because it's partially shaded, but also, never underestimate the importance of proper cultural practices. So mowing so that you're not removing more than 1/3 of the leaf blade. Fertilizing so that you're favoring the crowns and the roots, not the leaf tissue. So more in the fall, less in the spring. But in the moment now, what I would say is that, if your lawn is irrigated that you're making applications to, supply enough water to maintain the green color, or just go ahead and let it go fully dormant. But don't do the thing where you water it until it turns green, then allow it to dry out, and then water it again. After it starts to look like my neighbor's house across the street there, in order for that to recover, you're generating new leaf tissue from scratch at tremendous expense of the carbohydrate reserves in the crown. And so if you generate that leaf tissue and then let it go dry and then generate that leaf tissue again, you're really diminishing the health of the turf, and it's going to end up causing long-term loss of stand density. Okay. But given the drought that we're in right now, if you have let the lawn go fully dormant, know that the crown still needs some hydration. And so the general recommendation is about 1/2 inch of water every 2 to 3 weeks. And, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but when you're looking at a dormant stand of turf, if it looks tan, it's dormant. If it looks gray, it's dead. So you can kind of get a gauge for when it's time to, and you can also dig down in there and you can check the status of the crowns. There should be, a tiny amount of green and, like they seem like they're kind of imbibed. They're just not producing leaf tissue. But, you do need some water in order to keep the crowns of Kentucky bluegrass and our other cool season grasses alive. So as far as applying other things, fertilizers, pesticides, and etc., if the client has an irrigated lawn or if you have an irrigated space, you can proceed as normal. But if the turf has drought injury symptoms, kind of like the houses across the street that I showed you, making a herbicide application is probably going to make that look worse. All of our herbicides can have the potential to cause some brief injury phytotoxicity to the turf grass, and that's greatly exacerbated when it's stressed, like it would be in a drought. The other thing is that if you're applying fertilizers, so the people that maintain the common spaces in my HOA applied fertilizer this week, and um, if it's the right kind of fertilizer, it will just sit there and it will be available, on the surface until we do receive rainfall, and then it will, start to do its thing. But be aware that if you're using, for example, urea, and that's a very popular source of nitrogen, just straight urea, not coated, um, again, because of the economics of it, that urea, under the right conditions, you can lose an exceptional amount of that to volatilization. And so, if you have just the right amount of water and the presence of the urease enzyme, you will convert your urea into ammonia gas that will escape to the atmosphere. And the amount that you can lose with just straight urea is not small. So this study here published in 2007, you can see that straight urea, they lost over a 10-day period 35% of it. So if you think you're putting down a pound of nitrogen per thousand, you're putting out 65/100ths of a pound of nitrogen, after you've lost that much to volatility. Now, if it's a coated urea or otherwise treated chemically to make it a slow release, so like methylene urea, then that volatility hazard goes down. But if you apply it in conditions where, let's say you put it out and then we get a little bit of water, but then it otherwise stays dry, you could end up losing a lot of this to, atmospheric loss. So I get the temptation to continue making applications as normal with this idea that, like once we get rainfall, that everything will be available and it will be used as per normal. But just be aware that, there are some of our materials that if you apply them, urea in particular, that you can end up losing quite a bit of that before it is ever used by the turf as a fertilizer. And that's what I have for today.
Thank you, David. Just on the follow up with a couple of questions this week about kind of next spring, and potentially looking at options. And so what we want to do is wait to see what this weather forecast does next week, and then we'll have a probably more in-depth conversation about if we need to make alternative options or plans for next spring as far as seeding, herbicides, things like that. We'll look to cover that next week. All right, Dr. Wu, follow that up.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to touch a little bit on insects and meanwhile on some disease as well. So we did our neat white grub curative trial last Friday, putting out some chemicals out, and then they reached surprisingly, they are still in second instars, even though this was in irrigated turf. And so this year we are, because of the drought situations, we probably are not having as many grub populations as they usually have. And also they have delayed development because of the drought situations. However, when grass is under stress, they have a lower tolerance. They are more susceptible to the damage of pests. So you still need to keep an eye on the potential damage, if possible. And meanwhile, I've been called for site visits a few times, and so it's claimed to be insect problems, but when we get there, actually turned out to be disease problems. Again, because of the drought situation, the disease need moisture conditions to occur, And because of the drought, some disease they do not have a chance to occur. However, in irrigated turf, there's still something going on, and especially the leaf spot. We have been seeing that quite a lot recently. And also in this week, I have started seeing anthracnose as well. So if you have irrigated lawn, you may still need to pay attention to the disease problems. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Dr. Shtlar, anything on fall armyworms?
Actually, no. Uh, I will give an update. I actually went out and got some fall armyworm eggs about 2 weeks ago. Brought them in, and sure enough, 2 days later, I had about 150 little tiny caterpillars in a petri dish. They soon ate all of the turf that I gave them, and so I put them in a bigger container with a lot more turf. They're now just in second instar. So 2 weeks later, they're only in second instar, but they're very merrily munching away in my jar, and I think they'll probably be third instars this weekend. And so why am I mentioning all of this? We first started noticing egg masses in the first week of September. And so here we are getting into the third week of September. And I think I mentioned when we first started seeing the egg masses that it would probably be about 2.5, 3 weeks before anybody potentially would see any damage from the fall armyworms. And I think with the cool nights that we've had, that's really slowing down the development of these caterpillars. But if we're going to see damage, it will probably be this next week. If you do see damage, remember there's two things you need to keep in mind. You can kill them quickly with a pyrethroid. That's pretty easy to do. Apparently, Xiaohui had a conversation with me also earlier this week. There was a lawn care person who wanted an organic control for these caterpillars. The problem with organics against large caterpillars is that most of the true organics don't work very well, especially if you're trying to use one of the Bacillus thuringiensis or BT products. BTs generally are most active on the first, second, and third instar caterpillars. Well, when you see the damage from fall armyworm, they're in the fifth instar, and they're not going to be susceptible to the BTs. Excuse me. About the only thing I could think of was possibly some of the azadirachtin materials or the spinosad materials. So the azadirachtin is like in the product azatin, and there's also a difference between azadirachtin and neem oil. Neem oil will kill these caterpillars, but it will only kill them by contact. You've got to spray the oil emulsion insecticide directly on the caterpillars. You have to hit about 40% of the exoskeleton of the caterpillar to have a lethal effect on it. And for most people, that's a lot of spray to apply, and these caterpillars during the daytime are probably hiding down in the thatch. So trying to actually hit them with an oil or a soap-like solution is going to be a little bit tough. So if you do need an organic, something like azatin that contains a certain percent of azadirachtin, the active ingredient in the neem extract. The other one, the conserve or the spinosad, we also know will kill caterpillars. But if you read on the spinosad label, it says if they're small caterpillars, you have one rate, and then you double that rate if you've got large caterpillars. So you would need those. Now, another thing that's happening, and let me share my screen here. Okay. Another thing that's happening on golf course greens and sometimes on the tees, the superintendents are seeing these little mounds of soil. This can be like, just an inch or so. You can see the sand grains in that are appearing. Now, curious superintendents that see these, if they dig into the soil, sometimes they'll find this little beetle in here. Here's the rear end of the beetle. If you completely dig it out, this is what the beetle will look like. And this is the infamous seed corn beetle. The beetles themselves are only about 1/4 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch, or well, no, 3/8 of an inch in length. So they're pretty small beetle. And normally people associate ground beetles as being predators. So they might think that they're digging around looking for food. But there's a whole guild of ground beetles that are germinating seed feeders. And this is one of those. That's why they call it the seed corn beetle, because in the springtime, when farmers plant corn, and that corn begins to germinate, these beetles will dig in, find that germinating corn grain, lay an egg there, and then the larva of this beetle will eat that germinating seed corn. What that means to me is that this beetle is thinking there's something germinating, on our in the soil of our greens and teas. It's been kind of one of the things that I've wondered, well, what are they going for? So I've taken a soil probe on many of these greens and pushed it in as far as I can and pulled it out. And what I've often found on these greens where these seed corn beetles are doing a lot of digging in is the beginning of a black layer, maybe 4 to 6 inches down. So I would strongly suggest, if you're seeing a lot of seed corn beetle digging on your greens, maybe you ought to pull a core out and see if you might have the beginning of that black layer. What can you do about these? Not much. The reality is that the adults that are digging in are not eating anything. And so most of our surface insecticides dissipate so rapidly, especially since we're irrigating these on a daily basis. And so you might kill the beetles for a day or two with a pyrethroid application, but after that, they'll dig right through that pyrethroid application and still kick up the little mound of soil. Now, another one that's doing the same thing is our friend, the turfgrass ant. Here in September, the turfgrass ant females have been released from new colonies. So we've got winged swarmers that are coming out. The males are much smaller than the females. These females are sort of a brownish color and can be up to almost a half an inch in length. But what they do is they take their nuptial flight, usually in the afternoon. After that nuptial flight, in which the females mate, they'll drop to the ground and try to dig into the ground to establish a new colony. Now they rip their wings off. You can see the wings are missing on this. We call it a potential queen, and she's going to dig a little burrow into the surface of the soil, kick up again a little mound of the soil, and so you'll see. And I've seen greens that there's literally 50 to 100 of these all of a sudden in one night on the surface. Now, the other reality is that 99.9% of these potential queens get killed or unsuccessful. The other ants don't like them. If the other ants discover them, they'll kill them and eat them and destroy them because they don't want competition in their area of the turf. Likewise, just like the seed corn beetle, since these females aren't eating anything as they dig into the soil, surface insecticides generally aren't very effective of knocking them down. What do I recommend? I know it's a little more effort, but if you are experiencing these, whip or drag the surface of the green to knock the little sand mounds down. They generally don't reappear. It's usually just the entrance of either the beetle or this ant that's kicking up that soil. So knock it down before you mow because That sand coming to the surface can dull your mower blades on the greens, and so I usually suggest knocking them down. If there's only a few of them, just go ahead and mow them over. And they shouldn't appear unless there's some new beetles coming in or a new emergence of the ant in subsequent days. So here in Ohio, this is one of the things we have to often deal with here in September, is knocking down the little mounds of soil from the seed corn beetle or the turfgrass ant. Ed, that's all I've got to report this week.
Thank you, Dr. Shtlar. If anybody thought that they were going to be talking about ants' butts and also people who worry about food in their kitchen, and it's Dr. Shtlar who's feeding the insects in the kitchen, he's definitely a unique one. Next week we'll be back. Hopefully we will have some rainfall finally to talk about, and potentially some of the early stages of recovery. And then maybe if we start to see more normal conditions, we will start to reduce the amount of our meetings. But expect to see us again next week, folks. And thanks for your time. We'll talk to you all soon.